Good morning, everyone. Thanks for showing up at 9 a.m. on a Sunday. So I'm going to introduce our four panelists, including myself, real quickly, and then we'll go ahead with the presentations. My name is Nate Rosenberg, and I'm a legal fellow and attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council, where my work focuses on the environment, our food systems, and inequality. And to my immediate right is Natasha Bowens. She's the author of the upcoming book, The Color of Food, Stories of Race, Resilience, and Farming. She spent the last 4 years gathering stories from Black, Native American, and Latina farmers and food activists who are revolutionizing the food system and preserving cultural foodways. Natasha started the Multimedia Project in 2010 after exploring the intersection of race, food, and agriculture on her blog, Brown Girl Farming. Her work has now garnered national media attention from The Atlantic, CNN, Bill Moyers, and others. And to her right is Chris Brown, Executive Director of the Agriculture and Land-Based Training Association. Chris has been the Executive Director of the Salinas, California-based nonprofit since 2012. Prior to that, he spent 14 years in the international economic field, managing projects in Ukraine, Romania, the Republic of Georgia, and Montenegro. Immediately before joining ALBA, he managed a Washington, D.C.-based research project studying market access for small farmers in Mongolia and Rwanda. Chris is a native of Berkeley and a graduate of UC Berkeley and UCLA. Jennie Stevens is the Executive Director of the Center for Heirs Property Preservation. She's served as the Executive Director of the Center since its inception in 2005. She's worked in the nonprofit world for 24 years in such positions as Fiscal Director at a community action agency, Sponsored Programs Director at a historically Black college, and Senior Program Director at Coastal Community Foundation. She also has several years of experience in consulting. She received her bachelor's degree from the College of Charleston, a master's in public administration from the University of Charleston, and a PhD in organizational leadership from Regent University.
Thank you all for having me. I'm going to kick today's session off by bringing some voices into the room. As Nathan mentioned, I'm the author of The Color of Food, The Stories of Race, Resilience, and Farming, which is really the result of a project that I started 5 years ago to amplify, honor, and preserve the voices of farmers and food activists of color. So I was able to travel around the country and interview over 75 farmers and food activists from several different communities of color. And though these farmers and food activists can't always be in the room, I really try to channel them in here with us and bring their stories here. So, we are now entering Cherokee land in the Great Smoky Mountains along the North Carolina-Tennessee border. This is home to the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Nation, the only federally recognized tribe of North Carolina, though many other Native American tribes live in the state. They are called the Eastern Band, with the larger Western Band based in Oklahoma, where the Cherokee were forced to relocate in the 1800s during what became known as the Trail of Tears. Eastern Cherokee land in the mountains of North Carolina is considered the original homeland of the Cherokee, and the tribal members are said it's all about who owns the land. All these initiatives we're trying in this movement don't shift power unless we shift who owns the land. This is Sandra Simone, owner and operator of Huckleberry Hill Farm, an organic meat, goat, and CSA farm in Talladega County, Alabama. My great-grandfather acquired this land here, but it was originally 2,000 acres. He arrived here in 1868 after working his passage to America from Mozambique. Why he chose this area, I don't know. I was told the hills and red clay soil reminded him of his home in Africa. How he was able to acquire so much land in those times is unclear. My daughters and I are still researching to see what we can find out. He had quite a sustainable operation. His family was large, 12 children, and they produced what they consumed. Sheep, cows, pigs, vegetables. They even had goats. He had a blacksmith shop, a sawmill, a general store, and even a spinning wheel to make clothing from the sheep's wool. They lived from this land. Now, most of it has been sold. It's no longer 2,000 acres. What was left was divided into parcels that went to his 8 surviving children. Then it started to get passed down through generations and became more and more subdivided. Once land gets subdivided like that, there's little you can do. The ownership over your land is lost. It happened to my family. I had a very difficult time acquiring my portion of our family land. The land was wrongfully subdivided, and it was a long legal procedure.
I'm told it's in the process. I get my money after the window of planting season, So that's why we know that it was a national crisis. And if our ancestors from slavery up until 1900 could manage to get almost 17 million acres of land, and we have lost 80% of it between 1920 and 1996, something wrong, Daddy would say. Something wrong. Something is wrong. But when we go back and look, in Pickford 1, there were 23,000 applicants, I believe it was. And only 12,000 of them were successful. When we look at who was successful, it was folk who were like me, who went in to get a loan and were mistreated, who had lost their land, who were no longer in farming, and who had no intention of going back into farming. Very few of the folk who were farming were successful in Pickford. Why? Because the ultimate goal of USDA was to put small farmers out of business. And they have pretty much done it. You got 990,000 black farmers in 1920, and by the year 2000, remember the quote, by the year 2000, you have less than 20,000 farmers. They're gone. You're not even a political mass to be dealt with.
This is a quote from Ralph Page of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. Land is the only real wealth in this country, and if we don't own any, we'll be out of the picture.
Hi. So as my title suggests, I'm going to focus on how the Jim Crow South shaped modern American farm policy. But I want to start by talking about the size of American farms. As you can see here, the average American farm is more than 10 times as big as the average European Union farm. And the average full-time farmer in the United States has more than or about 5 times as much land as the average full-time farmer in Germany. And this is despite the fact that German farms are just as productive, if not more productive, than American farms. Averages are often misleading, though, because in the United States, most farms are either really small or really, really large. So relatively few farms are anywhere near the average. A more useful indicator is the acreage midpoint, the point at which half of all cropland acres are on farms with more than the midpoint and half are at less than the midpoint. So in the United States, the midpoint has risen to 1,200 acres over the last, it's doubled over the last 30 years to 1,200 acres, which meaning that half of all our cropland is now owned by farmers that have over 1,200 acres. That means that fewer than 5% of our farms own the majority of our nation's cropland. And large-scale farms are also pretty much the only farms making any kind of serious money from farming. The USDA divides farms into residence farms, farms that don't have a full-time farmer, intermediate farms, farms that have a full-time farmer but gross less than $350,000, and commercial farms, farms that have a full-time farmer and gross more than $350,000. You can see here that while the median residence and intermediate farm loses money on any given year, the median commercial farmer makes a huge amount of money. Unfortunately, only about 9% of our country's farms are commercial farms, however, and about 34% are intermediate farms. So even a large majority of our country's full-time farmers fall into the intermediate farm category. In addition to high incomes, commercial farmers also have an incredible amount of wealth. Here you can see that the median commercial farmer has more than 22 times the wealth of the median white family and more than 1,500 times the wealth of the median black family. In most other developed countries, a wide range of farmers can live a comfortable middle-class lifestyle, but that's not the case in the United States. And to understand why wealth from farming is distributed so unequally in the United States, we have to go back to the New Deal when modern agricultural policy was largely shaped. The beginning of the New Deal was an exciting time for small farmers and their advocates. Roosevelt was elected in 1932 with a mandate to radically reshape agriculture in the United States and to save the small family farmer. In 1935, he created the Resettlement Administration to, among other things, support small farmers and create government agricultural cooperatives. Building on the Resettlement Administration, a group of Southern politicians passed the Bankhead-Jones Act 2 years later, promising to radically reduce inequality in agriculture. The act absorbed the Experimental Resettlement Administration into a new, larger agency called the Farm Security Administration. The Farm Security Administration provided financial support to small farmers and substantial funding for the federal government to buy land, parcel it into family-sized plots, and sell them at incredibly affordable rates to sharecroppers and other farmers that had to rent their land. The new agency had an incredible amount of support, especially in the South. Theodore Bilbo, Mississippi's junior senator, called it the greatest piece of legislation that's been introduced in the American Congress in the last 50 years. The Farm Security Administration proved to be a tremendous success, and its funding increased rapidly. In 1943, the New Republic wrote, "The Farm Security Administration is the only government agency helping the majority of small farmers as distinct from the minority of big farmers." By the time of this editorial, it had a budget of over $4 billion after adjusting for inflation. This was less than its supporters wanted, but it was still a massive amount of support for small farmers. To give you an idea of how much that is, the FDA was appropriated about the same amount in 2014. Despite its success, the Farm Security Administration faced increasingly hostile attacks, led by Ed O'Neill, a planter from Alabama and president of the American Farm Bureau Federation. You can see Ed O'Neill in the center of this picture. His attacks against the Farm Security Administration were explicitly racial, designed to stoke white fears of self-reliant black farmers and to reaffirm white prejudices that blacks were better off as sharecroppers, with white landlords giving them a helping hand, than as independent farmers. O'Neill liked to tell of his own experience with his black tenants in Alabama, which you can read about on the next slide, but I want to warn you that the language is highly offensive. So here's the quote from O'Neill. For O'Neill and for many white Southerners during Jim Crow, the maintenance of white supremacy was a critical element of federal agricultural policy. In the early 1940s, the Alabama chapter of the American Farm Bureau began mailing its members literature by a racist anti-labor organization called the Christian American Association. When a Senate committee asked O'Neill about this practice, he defended it, indicating that the interests of white farmers were tied to the interests of white supremacy. I tell farmers, he said, that if they can't join any farm organizations, they should join the Ku Klux Klan. O'Neill was right that the Farm Security Administration threatened white supremacy. FSA officials were careful to respect what they called Southern customs. They maintained segregated buildings and events and supported poor white farmers much more readily than poor black farmers. But by giving blacks loans, credit, grants, and land, they were perceived as a serious threat to Jim Crow. Here's what an FSA official had to say about the dynamic decades later. Those Southerners who were bitterly opposed to us were opposed for understandable reasons. Our efforts to improve farming techniques were not the ends, but rather the means by which poor farmers of the South, many whites, but especially Negroes, might be made more effective politically and socially. This is Theodore Bilbo, the senator who said that the bill creating the Farm Security Administration was the greatest piece of legislation in the previous 50 years. Bilbo was born into a poor farming family. He gained office through the votes of poor farmers, and he claimed to champion the interests of poor farmers. But when the interests of poor white farmers clashed with those of white supremacy, Bilbo, who was a member of the KKK and advocated for the complete expulsion of blacks from the South, fell squarely on the side of white supremacy. And so did the rest of the legislators from the South. In 1943, they voted to a person to kill the agency, which they had worked so hard to create 6 years earlier. In the Jim Crow South, politicians wouldn't and couldn't support small farmers in any systemic way because doing so upset the racial order. And proponents of large-scale agriculture like Ed O'Neill used this to their advantage. Because Southern legislators couldn't directly discriminate against blacks in federal legislation, they ensured that blacks wouldn't benefit from federal agricultural laws in part by crafting them to favor large-scale operations. Even after the New Deal, government support of large-scale, capital-intensive agriculture was used as a tool to increase the power of white elites while also providing them with a defense against charges that they were discriminating against black farmers. This had drastic consequences for all small farmers, not just black ones. As historian Pete Daniel notes, federal agricultural policy and labor-saving science and technology became weapons that ruthlessly eliminated sharecroppers, tenants, and small farmers. But while small farmers of all backgrounds were affected, black farmers were the primary target, especially after the civil rights movement began to gain steam in the 1950s. According to Daniel, the situation for rural blacks was bad enough before the Brown decision, but after Brown, USDA programs were sharpened into weapons to punish civil rights activity. As black families began to lose their farms at a shockingly high rate, USDA officials and Southern white elites claimed that this had nothing to do with discrimination. Instead, they insisted it was all about farm size. I'm going to show you another quote containing offensive language, this time from 1968. It's from a high-level USDA official who was trying to defend his agency after he was asked why it wasn't supporting black farmers. Structural discrimination is often more subtle than this, but the historical record is clear. It was widespread, and it played a crucial role in the creation of modern foreign policy. For about 40 years, from the beginning of the Roosevelt administration until the end of the Johnson administration, the South contained the most powerful and the most effective farm lobby in the country. This was also a time when the government was spending a massive amount of money on transforming American agriculture. This money, as should be clear by now, primarily went to white farmers practicing large-scale agriculture. This has had negative consequences for the environment, our food system, and for rural communities throughout the country. It also deprived black families of what had been their biggest source of wealth for an incredibly long time, just as they are beginning to secure their civil rights. While the total amount of land owned by white farmers has dropped about 5% since 1920, the amount of land owned by black farmers has fallen about 90%. And the percentage of black farmers has fallen even more. In 1920, about 14% of our country's farmers were black, and today less than 2% of them are. Due to this drop, white farming is now the whitest profession in the United States, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics data. As a result, black families own almost none of the $2.5 trillion worth of wealth owned by American farming families. If the gap in farm ownership were eliminated, the average black family's wealth would be more than 10 times larger than it is currently. This wouldn't eliminate the racial gap in wealth, as you can see here, but it would be a significant step. This graph shows the extent to which eliminating different disparities between white and black households would increase the wealth of black families. You can see that eliminating the gap in farm ownership would benefit black families almost twice as much as eliminating the black-white income gap. It would also be almost 20 times as powerful as eliminating the disparity in educational attainment, an issue that gets a significant amount of attention from policymakers. As it turns out, eliminating the disparity in farm ownership between black and white families is one of the most powerful tools we have to reduce the racial wealth gap. This is the slide where I start to get meta and talk about justice. We can have an urban farm on every block, a CSA box for every American, and a corner store overflowing with fresh, affordable fruits and vegetables on every street. But we're not going to have a just food system until the wealth that our food system produces is equitably shared. And that's not going to change until we address inequality, both racial and economic, in agriculture. Politically, that's not going to be easy. But the good news is that there's a lot we can do. I'm happy to talk about some of our policy options during the Q&A, but the next two speakers are going to talk about what their organizations are doing today to change this dynamic. Thank you.
It's you. Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone, and seems like getting up on a Sunday morning this early deserves more than thanks, so I'll say congratulations. I'm going to talk a little bit about, clearly some terrible injustices have happened in our past with regard to minority farmers. I try to talk a little bit about a ray of hope or two, and really a tremendous opportunity as I see it. ALBA, the Agriculture and Land-Based Training Association, is based in Salinas, California. It was founded back in 2001, so we've been around a little while. We run a farm incubator, we're a nonprofit farm incubator on 2 farms on 150 acres in Monterey County. And our mission is basically to grow farmers. That's what it says on our sign going down our dirt road. Establish small organic family farms, mainly for low-income aspiring farmers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means in terms of the profile of our farmers. But here's the gist of our Farmer Education and Enterprise Development Program. Anybody see the acronym there, FEED? You got to have a snappy acronym when you're a nonprofit, as you all know, doing fundraising for the donors. It's a 5-year program. And it starts year 1. We accept 30 people a year into our classroom out of about 70 applications. And it's a pretty intensive 9-month program. Meets twice a week, about 7 hours per week. 1 weeknight and 1 weekend. And they have 5 modules: organic production, business planning, marketing, and then a couple applied farming modules on our 1.3 acre practice plot. Those that finish have the option of, they graduate from that course, have the option of leasing land in the second year. It starts out as a ½ acre, and then over the course of the remaining 4 years can go up to 5, even more acres. And during that time, they're expanding, they're learning about all aspects of farm management, organic production, crop rotation, cover crop, labor management, compliance, and all aspects of running not only a farm but a business. And so the idea is by the time the 5th year comes, they're ready to transition off and continue farming independently. Okay. An additional, the third service is a food hub. You've probably been hearing this term. It's kind of a hot new term these days, and it basically recognizes the difficulty, well, on one end, the demand for local produce and small farm produce, but also the difficulty that small farmers have in bringing their product to market. Are Latinos, they're farm workers. They're making per person, around $15,000 a year. They want to do better for themselves. They see the opportunity. They are entrepreneurial, they're risk-taking, and they want to benefit from their hard work. I had a hard time getting the number of farm workers. We got about 2 million small farms now. If they're all nearing 60, let's just say half are going to retire in the next generation. Who's going to replace them? We have a massive talent pool out here of people who I like to say have the will and the skills to do farming. And I think investment into this talent pool is a huge opportunity to overcome some of the barriers here that they're facing, which we talked about, the language, education, and business experience here. But the external factors, we talked about land. Jennie's going to talk more about that. Land ownership, by the way, is virtually impossible. Because the price per acre in the Salinas Valley is something like $30,000-$40,000 per acre. We can obtain operational credit, very little credit. Most banks don't want to touch ag, as you know. A small loan for them for a very established ag business is $500,000. Our beginning farmers need in the area of $5,000 to $20,000. Fortunately, we have a nonprofit partner, California Farm Link, who does just that, and they do an excellent job of it. But that's basically their only option. Some other FSA programs are coming up, but for a Latino farmer with limited English, difficult to access. Services, same thing. There's extension out there. Language skills, the USDA extension agents, not always there. Our farmers are often pretty timid and disenfranchised to be able to contact.
In my neck of the woods, see, I told you I was going to go the opposite direction. In my neck of the woods, heirs property owners tend to be African American, but that is not always the case. One of our funders, the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation, told us that they could literally pick up our work, take it to the Appalachian, the skin tone of the landowner would change, but it would be the same issues. And part of that is that once African Americans acquired land, and you've heard the stories from our panelists, that one, they didn't trust the legal system. And so the way in which they would pass down their land is they would say, Jim, you've got the piece by the road. Barbara, you've got the piece by the tree. And we want you to keep this land intact so that no matter who's moving up north, they can always come back and have a home. Well, we all know if it's not in writing, what happens? It's not valid. And so the law does not honor oral wills. So the Center for Heirs Property Preservation was created in 2005, and for the strict purpose of preventing the loss of land, specifically heirs property, because as we've gotten older, we've looked at what USDA, they define these landowners in a couple of ways. Some of them, the term that I totally hate is socially disadvantaged. That really says a lot about us, doesn't it? And the other is historically underserved landowners. Those are the landowners that we're working with. We want to make sure that the landowners can sustainably use their land. And we use the tools of education. You know, if you ask me what is our primary tool that we're providing to the community, it's education, because we want landowners to make informed decisions about how their land can be used. Because heirs property, the resolution to it is you need a lawyer. We're providing the legal services. And just in 2013, we began with a forestry or sustainable forestry component. And yes, you've heard the stories about USDA, and you'll see the logos on my slide. It's not so much that I'm praising them, but I'm saying that the center is now involved in an initiative with the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, which is not a governmental agency, along with the USDA Forest Service and NRCS, where we're trying to right a wrong. We're working with landowners who typically would run across, as I said, you heard from my panel colleagues, that they could not benefit from the services of USDA. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The center currently serves 7 counties along the coast of South Carolina. I usually say them alphabetically because that way I can remember them. So, but I'll actually walk you through the map. So you start at Georgetown, we moved over to Berkeley, then to Charleston, Dorchester, Colleton, Beaufort, and we've added Jasper. And these are the counties under our legal service program. With our sustainable forestry program, we have picked up the counties of Williamsburg, Orangeburg, and Hampton, so 10 counties. The map that I call my measle map, we had been asked so many times, how much heirs property is there in your service area? And initially we'd look at people and say, we don't know, but we do know it's an issue. But as we grew as an organization, we could no longer get by with saying, we don't know, but we think it's a lot. So today I'm here to tell you that we have identified that there are at least 47,000 acres in our 7 county service area. So just want to share that with you. And we started with the coastal counties for 2 reasons. One, our nonprofit started as a project of a local community foundation, and they served the coast of South Carolina. But when you think about where land is being lost, where is it being lost? Along the coast of South Carolina. Typically, heirs property owners, they acquired land, either working for it or purchasing it, that one, there's this thing called mosquitoes, which we say is our state bird in South Carolina because they're so big. So they figured out how to kill the mosquitoes, and we have flood insurance. And so what at one time property that no one wanted is now very valuable. You know, if you can smell the marsh, you don't even have to be very close to it, but if you can smell it, it has now become prime real estate. And it's so easy for this land to be lost because it only takes, and I don't like to pick on developers, but it takes someone outside of the family, just an opportunity to buy somebody's share, because they own it as a percentage. They don't own a particular piece of land, it's a percentage. So all it takes is somebody from outside of the family to buy a percentage of the property or an heir's share, and now they become the newest member of the family and they can force a sale. There are many dimensions to the issue of heirs property. Talk about it. I'm going to speed up since I don't have a lot of time, but it's social, you know, it's cultural. Communal land ownership is what African Americans have, that's what we're accustomed to doing. And because, as one of my advisory committee members said, as African Americans, we went from being slaves, we went from being property to now owning property. So this land means so much more to us than just the environment and just the green, the money. Definitely it has a legal dimension, as we talked about, environmental and the economic, because I think it was on Natasha's slide. It's one of the greatest wealth builders in the world, land. And if you don't have, basically heirs property owners they have this literally diamond in the rough. And because they don't have clear title, they cannot get the maximum use or the maximum price, even if they should sell it, for this property, because they don't have clear title. Okay, so speeding up, barriers to building wealth, lack of knowledge. Really, as I said, it resulted because of lack of trust, but lack of knowledge. And the AP back, I think it was in 2007, I think it was, they did a series of articles titled Torn from the Land. And they talked about how African Americans lost land. And one story that stuck out to me is that a gentleman went to file his deed at the courthouse, and he gave it to the clerk of court. And so 1 year later, of course, he's looking for a tax bill, right? That's what we all do who own property. We have to pay taxes. And when he went back to the courthouse, guess whose name was now on the deed? The clerk. Mm-hmm. It wasn't his. And so you can see why these individuals they believed in doing things orally, because they knew you could not rely upon the system to really protect what was yours. And then the whole estate planning, we asked the question, who teaches you what to do with your loved one's property when they die? You don't learn that in school. That's not in civics class. It's not in home ec. So how are people supposed to know that when grandma dies or grandpa dies, here's actually what you do? And then the cultural beliefs that it's okay. Actually, people believe that the best way to hold onto your land is to hold it as heirs property. And I'm told I have 1 minute, so I'm going to really speed up. So partition sales, and I think it was Natasha who referred to partition sales, and that just basically means cutting it up. Land that may have had large acreage, it's now been reduced for whatever reason. And then the greatest, I think, travesty sometimes is the underutilization of the asset. People don't know what they really own. There are others outside of the family, outside of the community, who see the economic potential of their land. And if you don't know what you own, then you don't know how to maintain it. Example with the forestry program is that we had heard horror stories, and forestry, by the way, is a form of agriculture and farming. It's just not food, but it's about because you plant trees, therefore it's agriculture. How timber buyers would approach our landowners and say, "Oh, I'll give you $10,000 to cut this 1,000 acres." No, it doesn't take a rocket scientist, but that doesn't even sound right. And then you go back later on and you find it. Actually, another example, we had one lady who approached us. She had 200 acres of wooded property. She had 2 quotes from timber buyers, one for $40,000, one for $90,000. Well, when she talked to us about it, our forester who's on staff said, "Let me connect you with some of the folk that I know." She's now being offered $400,000 for the same land that those 2 gentlemen, and so one, it goes back, I said, lack of knowledge.
There were no subsidies until 1964 for cotton, except a little bit at the beginning.
I'm counting, well, if you count parity as a subsidy. Okay,
Living wage
fair
is not
enough.
a government check.
Okay.
A minimum wage is not a government check.
Yeah, we can discuss the specific. I mean, we're getting kind of technical in terms of the Farm Bill debate, but
You're either on one side or the other. That's a technicality of the issue of that the Federation wants.
yeah, and I think there's a larger issue of who benefits from the subsidies, and there are different ways to structure it, and I think there are a variety of ways that we could structure it that would improve upon the current situation.
I think we have to remember the history that we're highlighting and the distrust of the government, and I feel like that's where Gary Grant and his organization really stands. While they might agree that yes, of course, we need to support a living wage for farmers, the way that we
Water table is lowered so much. So, and we've got a permit now. We're hoping we can get through this season, and the well won't go out. It's getting serious.
And it's extremely expensive to be able to dig down deeper to hit that water table. I interviewed some farmers that they were struggling right there and were having to take their crops out, take their orchard, half of their orchards out, and make that really heartbreaking decision of do I eradicate half of my farm to save on irrigation costs so that I can dig this deeper well. And then speaking about water, I just also want to say that not only are communities of color losing their land, but they're losing rights to water. I interviewed Navajo farmers in Arizona who are right now struggling with the not first time, but multiple time theft of their water rights, where water is being taken from their reservation and funneled to California and Las Vegas and Phoenix, and it's a huge issue. It's the issue of our time, along with land.
Okay, my name is Jan Storm, and I'm nervous. So I'm a volunteer with the Citizens Climate Lobby, and I want to first try to connect some dots, just very briefly, with like climate justice issue and the food system justice issue from what I've observed over commonalities with the panel discussions that occurred yesterday and even today. And with climate, so the commonality is that the climate change is a huge, multidimensional problem. And there are many people that recognize that, and they're trying to address it through many different ways. For example, small farmers focusing on carbon sequestration, people focusing on, adaptation, vulnerable populations, many, many different things that people are doing. It seems that's the same with the food system problem. We have people dealing with justice issues, land ownership issues, food distribution issues, all kinds of things that comprise the problem with the overall food system. So what my question is going to be is that our organization believes that the solution that they're advocating for is not as important as the process. So what this organization is, it's a civic action organization that's organized at the local, the national, and the international level, which has developed a very simple upstream solution to internalizing the cost of carbon, which is now socialized, we all pay, and it is focused on getting the federal government to act. So what has happened with the movement is that the solution is so simple, it's called a carbon fee and dividend, that individuals that are working on climate justice from all these different areas can get behind it, and they feel like they have a way of dealing with this comprehensive issue, something that they can do as a single citizen to influence the federal government. And what I've heard in all and it seems to be working because we now have representatives at the table, not only at the Lima UN negotiations, but are sort of mobilizing with other organizations under this umbrella of Pathway to Paris to bring civic society actively to the negotiations that are happening in Paris to deal with this global climate thing. So it's fundamentally going after the problem at the federal level. And what I've heard from all of the people working in the food system panels here is we talk about the issues, but when it gets to the federal government, we just kind of, what I've heard people do is they just kind of talk around it. So my question is, maybe it's to Nathan, is there, and if there's not, why not, a single sort of simple solution that this people concerned about food system justice can take and lobby for and get enacted at the federal level. And I know it's very complicated. Just one more thing. So the focus of the Citizens Climate Lobby is to empower individual citizens to have the political will to interact with respectfully and with gratitude, regardless of ideology, with their elected officials. So, what they've done, I think, effectively is they've transgressed huge ideological divisions, maybe some like you were just describing, but between Republicans and Democrats, Tea Party, Libertarians. Everybody can get behind this simple solution, and it's a market-based solution, which is really hard for me to accept. But I just wonder whether the food system. And I mean, Nathan, you talked about the role of the federal government in making farm policy. So it seems like that's kind of where all these issues come together. And so my question is there some kind of a movement like that? Thank you.
Sure, yeah, and I'd love to hear what the other panelists think too, but I think most successful social movements in our history have been messy and have had a lot of goals, sometimes conflicting. So I don't know, I don't think we'll ever necessarily have one clear defined goal, at least when it comes to food, and but I don't know if we need to. But yeah, definitely, I think there's a lot of really interesting and important things that are happening at the local and state level, but we'll definitely have to tackle these issues at the federal level. At the same time, I do think when we're talking about food and we're talking about agriculture, we're also talking about power. And so whatever happens, some people are going to lose relative power. And so I don't think we're ever going to have a solution that's going to keep everyone happy.
If you don't mind, I'll jump in. A few things. So I think it's a mistake for us as a movement to want to, we have this need and this sense of urgency to hurry up and solve all of these issues and to do it the easiest way possible, right? To find one beautiful, perfect umbrella solution, and it's just not the case. And I think we're doing ourselves a disservice to try to go down that road. I understand the drive for it, but it's too complex of a system, it's too complex of an issue. In the same breath, I'm going to say that I really don't like this divide of language, really, when we talk about climate justice, food justice, environmental justice. We all eat food, we all live on this planet, and we all deserve the right to a healthy planet and healthy food. So I agree that we need to really build on the similarities and the parallels in our movements and come together. And I think there's a lot of overlap in the federal policies that we're all striving for. And I'm going to let you talk because maybe I'm misunderstanding your question. Go ahead.
I think you are. What I forgot to say is that the argument that's put forward from people that are much more articulate than I in the organization is that with the particular solution, which it's inappropriate to go into, but with that solution at the federal level, it makes accomplishment of all the other objectives easier.
But does
So
it
that's
though?
the idea.
That's my challenge. But does it though? You know what I mean? Like when you were you were making a gesture, and I'm sorry to be the devil's advocate, but you made a gesture that I thought was so perfect when you started building up, and then you said the federal government, and you went like this, and to me that was so symbolic of a standstill that we have right now in progress, in my opinion, a ceiling that has been really hard to break. And I know that some people might challenge me and say that having that opinion isn't productive, because obviously I know we need to attack that beast. But I have seen, and where I get my hope from, is what's happening on the ground, and what's happening at local levels. And I understand and am grateful for those who are punching away at that ceiling at the federal level, because it needs to be happening simultaneously. But I don't put my hope, especially now. And it goes back to, and what Nathan touched on perfectly, is who has held power in this country since day one, and we're not addressing it, and it's not changing, even with who is in office as our president right now. I think that has promoted and catapulted a whole, dug up things that have been percolating under the surface all this time and that have not gone away, right? So we're still facing that issue, and it's a problem, and I think that a lot of communities see that, and so they're not heading towards the federal government. They're not putting their hope there.
And again, I want to emphasize that we're not putting our hope only in the federal government. I mean, it's obviously all of these more efforts that are happening at levels below the federal government are essential. The one thing I think, the other concept is that with citizen engagement at all levels and into the Congress and internationally, what I think it contributes to overall is a democratization with a small d of all of these issues that we've lost because of the corporatization of our government and all of the problems that we have right now. And then I'll just be quiet.
And I'll shut up too, just to bring Frances Moore-LePay back into the room, if anyone caught her keynote yesterday. There is possibility for solutions if we had a democracy. I agree with her, we don't anymore, right? So there's these larger issues that have to come first, right? And I'll shut up.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Tiffany Hayden. I'm here representing Farms, an organization that's based in the Southeast. And I do have a question specifically for, is it Jennie or Jeannie?
Jennie.
Jennie. And anyone can chime in as well. In the work that you're doing, Jennie, how do the farmers ensure that their heirs are ready to take on land ownership and farming responsibilities? And then I have a second part question. Are you seeing an increase in young Black farmers, given that I know, Chris, you mentioned the average age is about 58 for, was it Latino farmers or?
No, all farmers.
For all farmers, but I know specifically for Black farmers, it's 65. So, it's really important for young Black farmers to step up and start taking ownership.
In relation to succession planning, because that's basically what you're asking about, that as people are aging, are they making sure that there is someone in line? For us, what we're doing is with our forestry program, so the farmers that we deal with are more the foresters. So with our farming program, we have paired a younger generation with the older generation. And it's been interesting to hear the dynamics that the older generation think the younger generation really doesn't care about the land and that they're probably gonna sell it as soon as they die. But when you speak to the younger heir of that person, they're saying, no, I really know how important this land is to my father and I am going to keep it. And we are stressing the whole issue of succession planning. We're providing workshops so that the older landowner and the younger one get to hear the same information at the same time. And they're beginning to have the conversation about, well, what does happen once I exit the scene? Bill, Jane, they will be in place to take care of it. Your second question.
It was regarding, are you seeing an increase in Black farmers within your area?
Well, as I said, the farming aspect is we don't see a lot of it in our area. We have a lot of people who own land that's dormant. It's either wooded or it just hasn't been maintained. So farming isn't big per se in with the landowners that we're working with.
Pivot that question to you. How do you deal with successes in your program after those 5 years?
What do we do with successes? People are doing well upon graduation. Increasingly, we've got to pick up this issue because we're having more success. People are really taking more interest. The level of retention in our program. There's a number of reasons for that. I won't divert into that, but the fact is, it wasn't until 2011 where we had to ask people. 2012, we had to ask people to leave our land. It wasn't fully occupied by program participants. Now it is, and now we've got to kind of nudge some out who've been there for a few years to make room for new farmers. And so what I call transition services have become a big issue. We put all this investment and time into farmers to bring them to a certain point. They want to get a piece of land, but this transition point is an extremely vulnerable time because, first of all, it's very hard. Land is very tightly held in the Salinas Valley. They're more likely to get land on marginal lands in the hills up in North County. That has all sorts of implications in terms of, they got their legs on a piece of land in primo Salinas Valley land, and you get up into the hills, microclimates, different soil types, more habitat, lots of issues. So my point is they're very vulnerable at this point. It'd be an awful shame to have everything fall apart in the first year or the second year after graduation. So we have to put a lot more attention into not only finding them land, and California Farm Link, by the way, is also, in addition to the financing of farmers, they also do land matching. So we're going to get in tighter with them, and we're trying to work together to create a network of organic land owners who are willing to lease to small operators. And that's another challenge because if you're renting land, you want to be with someone who has established track record, speaks the same language as you, and has deeper pockets. So it's a tough sell sometimes. Our farmers have been quite resourceful with our limited services thus far. I've asked about a dozen farmers to leave. About 9 have continued to farm, and they, for the most part, have found their own land. Anyway, it is a very important thrust, and I just wrote a proposal to USDA to help fund that.
May I add one other thing to the question I was asked? One of the ways, because it's typically thought that the younger generation, they're going to sell the land because they're looking at the money. And one of the things that we've been able to do with the forestry program is we can show to the families that if you don't manage your land, whenever you're cutting the timber or getting other timber products, you may yield about $1,000 per acre. But if you are accessing the programs from USDA, you're implementing the conservation practices and properly managing your land, you can receive between $5,000 to $7,000 an acre. So that helps that conversation about how people are going to stay and how it's not, the land isn't seen as a burden, but it actually is seen as a business that you can viably operate later on.
And if I may, I had my own question for you, Jennie, while we're still on this topic, and then we'll get to your, and you kind of just touched on it, but so I have seen an increase of young farmers, black farmers, and farmers of color in the Northeast and outside of the rural South, but also in the rural South. But my question is, a lot of folks that their ancestors, came from the South and had land, they don't know that they might actually still have ownership over land. Folks that have left and are in Detroit and in New York.
It's the Phillies, that's what we say. It's the people from Philly, they're the ones.
Really? Is your organization doing anything to help families identify land ownership? And then also for folks who aren't interested in farming, and you touched on that with the forestry project, are there other options? Because we're not going to get everyone to go back to farming, but still understanding that just keeping that land in the family, maybe putting it in a land trust,
right,
or leasing it to another young farmer who is interested but doesn't have land in his family or her family. And so my question is, do you address those issues?
In relation to, because as I said earlier, there are people who don't even know that they own land in the South. And the joke is it's the Philly and the New York folk that kind of upset the apple cart when we're trying to resolve the issue. But part of it is we do a lot of seminars, and we do them at family reunions because the people from up north do come back home to the South. So that is one of our ways of reaching out, but we haven't figured out yet how to just, reach out to the North outside of the family reunions. The second question was around other options of land use outside of farming. And part of we title our seminars, How to Make Your Land Work for You. And so forestry may not be the solution for some folk, or because we're doing agroforestry too, so that may not be an option. But we have our partners who are land trusts who are there at the workshops, so they're learning about their options in relation to land trusts. We have now, we've got 2 of our landowners who were approved for a $2.2 million conservation easement. So it's all about just the exposure and knowing what the options are. So we are providing here are some things that you can do that may not relate to farming, or it may not relate to forestry.
Thank you.
So I'm from Georgia, and my study is Dicho de la Casa. And what I do is I try to align Latinos into the sustainable agriculture economy. But as this panel is the widest profession, it seems like another thing that is very similar in the sustainable ag sector is the whole grant bureaucracy that's out there. So what I wanted to ask is, as you may know, my study is more proactive in that I think that there's a lot within the ideology of how Latinos just know food that can be best expressed in maybe creating a nonprofit and so on. So farming is great. You can make your own little statement. But do you have anything in place, such as grant writing skills, attending workshops, and how? Because I think this essentially, you open it, you have the ability to portray your ideology, and how generalizable your lens is, it is what it is. So like with the Latinos or the African Americans or who you're trying to help, is there something in these programs already to teach them how to get into that bureaucratic or understand the bureaucratic culture of how to get a grant and start your own nonprofit based on a great idea?
I'll take that.
Okay.
We actually have a grant right now. What is it called? You're going to love this. Socially disadvantaged and veteran farmers and ranchers. OASTFR, we call it. 2501, right. We have one of those now, and we one of our objectives is outreach to socially disadvantaged farmers. We do anything for a grant, right? There are certain ones that are really designed to go directly to farmers, like EQIP, for implementing conservation practices on the farm. And we help them apply for that. There are other ones like the value-added producer grant for farmers who want to set up maybe just a minor processing facility to add value and market their product. But you're right. I mean, it is a completely foreign world to many farmers, this whole grant bureaucracy. I don't know any easy way. Frankly, it is to a lot of my staff too. It took me, 3 or 4 years in Washington to be able to kind of understand what it is to give a donor what they want and write grants and things like that. So it's a very, very difficult thing. That's why I think organizations like us exist, so we can channel grant funds to the benefit of farmers. Sure, inform them of opportunities, and that's what this Department of USDA wants. And there are some very limited programs that are, I think, manageable. Farmers can manageably access, but for the most part, it's a huge leap to actually teach people to really, do the whole proposal thing and win grants. That's it in a nutshell. Does that answer your question? It's kind of a cynical answer, I suppose.
Yeah, but it promotes kind of the reality of what there is. I think part of this democracy that we're accessing for is being able to express your ideology fairly if it really does align in promoting sustainable agriculture. But how do you word it so that those people who are historically used to seeing the grant applications in one direction, because that's the culture they understand, couldn't really interpret the benefit when it comes from someone, in other cultures, maybe ideology. So how do you facilitate that kind of momentum amongst that culture that you can go out there and create a nonprofit with just a great idea without having to word it in a way that someone else has to understand it and accept it.
But if the goal is to support farmers and get farmers, minority farmers farming, isn't it better to just make sure that USDA has policies and programs and there are nonprofit opportunities out there that support them so they can stay in farming? Because farming and grant writing together, probably not a great mix. Yeah, it's a very rare balance of skills. I think what we want is a limited number of nonprofits who do it quite well and can channel USDA and other agency funds to be able to support those farmers in doing what they do best.
Well, my title prior to this was I was a senior program director at a community foundation. And what part of my job was to work with neighborhood based organizations to help them as into the grant writing, those things. I think right now with our current landowners, we're not promoting the creation of a nonprofit. And this is where we may disagree. Running a nonprofit is hard. And getting the money is also even harder. But we are helping our landowners. You know, we're sitting with our landowners when it comes to filling out their applications to USDA. We're answering their questions. We're taking their applications over to USDA. We're introducing them to the individuals at USDA who will be processing their application. We're trying to make it as easy as possible. But when it comes to the sense of creating a nonprofit, no, we haven't been advocating that per se, but we have been making sure that they're able to navigate what is kind of crazy sometimes, all the questions they're asked on applications and helping them to understand that. And for one thing that we've noticed that there's a shortage of a particular, of businesses to work with smaller landowners. So we may actually help some of our landowners create those businesses. So we're there, but we're not a big advocate of creating another nonprofit because that's a challenge.
Okay, that's all the time that we have for this panel. Sorry, but you're more than welcome to come up here and talk with all of them. And right now we have some free time for you guys to go downstairs and check out the posters and the exhibits. And then I think our next thing up is the keynote.
Yeah, here. Isn't it here?